When Trevor Lancaster, a 34-year-old painter and art instructor from Portland, Oregon, married Riley, he hadn't imagined how quickly he would begin to lose himself. The shift started subtly. Riley had suggested they move into her family's home, a large, shadowy mansion on the outskirts of the city, inherited by her mother, Ella. The house stood like a monument to another era, tall windows, thick drapes that rarely opened, and rooms that creaked even without footsteps. From the first day, Trevor felt like a guest in someone else's carefully maintained illusion. There was a silence that clung to the walls, not from peace but from suppression. No television, no radio, no spontaneous laughter or music. Instead, the household moved in rhythm with unspoken rules. Family dinners served precisely at 6 o'clock, complete silence throughout the house after 9, and daily wellness updates that Riley recorded in a small leather-bound notebook, which she handed to her mother each morning. Trevor assumed at first that these were merely quirks, unusual but harmless traditions passed down through generations. But something about the house unsettled him. It wasn't just the eerie quiet or the almost religious adherence to routine. It was the absence of reflection, literally. Weeks passed before he fully realized there were no mirrors. Not in the bathrooms, not in the hallways, not even in the bedrooms. At first he thought it was an oversight, then a choice, then a warning. The more he looked, the more deliberate it felt. Surfaces that would normally hold a mirror were empty or covered. Even the picture frames on the walls displayed only faded landscapes or antique sketches. Never portraits, never glimpses of the present. Trevor found himself relying on shop windows or car mirrors just to see his own face. It unnerved him how quickly he began to forget what he looked like. Small details slipped first: how he parted his hair, the exact shade of his eyes, the lines around his mouth. In a home where reflection was forbidden, he began to feel erased. And deep down, something told him that was exactly the point. A few weeks into his new life in the house, Trevor began to feel strange. It started with dryness in his mouth that no amount of water could quench, followed by a persistent metallic taste that lingered no matter what he ate. Then came the nausea, subtle at first, then more pronounced each morning. He blamed it on stress, maybe the change in his routine, or the pressure of settling into unfamiliar territory. But the symptoms grew stronger, more consistent, and harder to ignore. Ella insisted on preparing his meals herself. She spoke of cleansing the mind through purity of body, praising the strict vegetarian diet she designed for him. Every dish came with herbal teas and strange supplements in unlabeled glass jars. Riley, once playful and independent, now echoed her mother's words, serving Trevor his meals with an obedient calm that unsettled him. It wasn't just food, it was ritual, rehearsed and rigid, and it left Trevor feeling observed, even when alone. Soon he noticed other changes. His personal belongings began to disappear. First it was small things: a razor, a favorite shirt, a bottle of cologne. Then his art supplies began to vanish. The brushes he had brought from his old studio were gone, replaced by cheap, soft, bristled ones that felt like they belonged to a child's starter kit. His clothing, too, was slowly exchanged. His jeans were replaced with looser, beige slacks. His dark sweaters disappeared, and in their place were pastels and soft fabrics he would have never chosen for himself. He questioned Riley once about the changes, gently, but she seemed confused by his concern. She told him he looked more appropriate now, that Ella had helped him find a better version of himself. That phrase echoed in his head for hours. He began to feel less like a partner in a marriage and more like a project in someone's plan. The house didn't want a man. It wanted someone malleable, compliant, easily shaped. He started to watch the food more closely, trying to detect anything unusual, but the meals always looked normal, if a bit bland. Still, each bite seemed to leave behind that same faint taste of metal. It clung to his tongue, settled in the back of his throat, and followed him into sleep. Something wasn't right. Something was being done to him, piece by piece, meal by meal, and he was running out of ways to pretend it was just in his head. Trevor had begun to suspect that the house held more than just an unsettling atmosphere. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day, and it reached a breaking point when he noticed something odd in the bathroom. Behind the vent cover above the sink, tucked into the shadows, was a tiny black lens. At first, he thought it might be a reflection or part of the fixture, but the smooth curve and steady glint confirmed what he feared. It was a camera. He searched the house quietly over the next few days, pretending to go about his routines while his eyes scanned corners, seams, and ceiling corners. More lenses appeared, hidden in the most intimate spaces, above the bookshelf in the study, behind the curtain rods in the bedroom, even inside a decorative bowl in the living room. The realization settled over him like a cold fog. He was being observed, not just by Ella or Riley, but by the house itself, which had become a vessel of silent surveillance. Trevor began keeping a secret journal. He wrote in it late at night, hunched over in the dim closet light, documenting his physical symptoms, the meals, the metal taste, and the odd behavior patterns of the two women. He recorded everything he noticed, the unnatural calm of Riley, the clinical way Ella spoke about health, and the subtle replacements of his belongings. The journal gave him a sliver of control, a way to fight back, even if only in whispers on a page. Then one morning it was gone. He searched everywhere, every drawer, every hidden spot he had used before. It had vanished without a trace. That night he was given tea that tasted bitter and unfamiliar. Within minutes his limbs felt heavy and distant, and his mind began to fog. He collapsed into sleep not in his bed, but on the floor beside it. When he woke, there was a folder neatly placed on his desk. Inside were medical documents bearing his name, blood work, psychological assessments, physician's notes. The report claimed he was suffering from somatic paranoia, a condition marked by imagined illnesses and delusions of persecution. The clinic listed on the letterhead didn't exist. The doctor's signature bled slightly at the edges, as if photocopied one too many times. Nothing was real. And yet the file sat there like truth etched in ink, waiting to be accepted. Trevor stared at it for hours, realizing the house was not just controlling his space or his diet, it was working to rewrite his mind, to erase the version of himself that once existed and replace it with a story more convenient for someone else. Trevor left the house early one morning, claiming he needed to buy new paints for a commission piece. Ella didn't question him, and Riley only gave a silent nod, her expression as blank as it had been for weeks. He took the long route into the city, bypassing familiar galleries and coffee shops, heading instead for a discreet private laboratory on the edge of the industrial district. The building was plain, tucked between warehouses and auto shops. No one asked questions. He handed over a small vial of his blood and filled out the paperwork with a false name, heart pounding as he did. The results came 2 days later, delivered through a secure digital link. He read them in the bathroom with the fan running, his laptop balanced on the closed toilet lid. There it was, clear and clinical, traces of a psychoactive compound so rare that it hadn't been mentioned in medical literature in over a decade. The substance had once been used experimentally in psychiatric hospitals across Europe, abandoned due to its unpredictable effects. Long-term exposure led to cognitive deterioration, heightened emotional dependence, and a slow erosion of individual will. It wasn't just a drug, it was a weapon. Trevor stared at the screen for nearly an hour. Everything snapped into place with brutal clarity. The dry mouth, the nausea, the shifting moods, the growing confusion. This wasn't stress or diet. It was methodical. He had been chemically sculpted into something pliable, something easier to manage. The vegetarian meals, the tea, the strange-tasting supplements Ella insisted he take. Every bite had been a small incision in his autonomy. When he returned to the house, it no longer looked the same. The walls felt closer, the air heavier, like the house itself had tightened its grip. Ella met him at the door with her usual serene gaze, the kind that masked calculation. Riley stood behind her, pale and silent, her hands folded in front of her, like a child awaiting permission to speak. Trevor no longer felt like a husband. He was a project, a subject of behavioral design. And Riley, she wasn't just complicit, she was the prototype. He saw it now, the way she deferred, the emptiness in her eyes, the obedience that wasn't born from love but from something chemical and precise. Ella had built a system, not a family, a machine of compliance, and he had been slowly wired into it. Trevor had been preparing in silence, careful not to disrupt the rhythm of the house. He hid cash in hollowed-out art books, slid prepaid burner phones into the linings of old coats, and made coded contact with a former university colleague, Margot, a woman who had once hinted that she didn't trust Riley's family. She was the only person who might believe his story, or at least help him vanish without asking too many questions. He memorized back roads out of Portland, mapped out supply stores, and committed every lock and creak of the house to memory. He knew he would have one chance. The night came when the house was quietest. Rain fell in steady sheets outside, masking his movements. He packed only what he needed: documents, cash, a flash drive with lab results and handwritten notes. As he reached for the doorknob of his studio, a shadow fell across the hallway. Ella stood there in her pale blue nightgown, holding a porcelain cup in both hands. The herbal scent wafting from it was familiar and horrifying. Before he could speak, the dizziness came. The walls blurred and pulsed. His knees buckled. He woke up on the cold wooden floor, his mouth dry, his arms heavy. The windows were blacked out. The lights didn't respond. His studio had been turned into a cell. The brushes were gone. The easel overturned. The door was locked from the outside. For the next 2 days, he remained in isolation. No food came. The only water was from a chipped jug, stale and tinged with something metallic. At intervals, voices filtered through the walls. Ella's calm monotone, Riley's faint murmurs. He couldn't make out words, only the rhythm, like a ritual being repeated without end. The darkness began to warp time. He scratched notes into the floor with a splinter from his desk, marked the hours with taps. Sleep came in waves, broken by tremors and hallucinations. At one point, he thought he heard his own name repeated over and over, but when he pressed his ear to the wall, there was only silence. By the third day, he knew they were waiting for something. His compliance, his collapse, maybe just for the chemicals to finish their work. The escape had failed, but the will to survive remained. And in that quiet, maddening dark, Trevor began to plan again. Rescue arrived when Trevor least expected it. His colleague Margot, unsettled by weeks of silence and unanswered emails, contacted the local authorities. When police forced open the locked studio door, they found him collapsed in the far corner, dehydrated and barely conscious. His pulse was weak but present. Puncture marks dotted his arms, signs of repeated injections. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Ella was arrested without resistance. She watched the officers with a calm detachment, offering no explanation as they led her away. Riley, pale and silent, was taken into protective custody and transferred to a rehabilitation facility under psychiatric supervision. Investigators uncovered decades of manipulation. Ella had orchestrated similar psychological conditioning with at least 4 other men over the past 10 years, all of whom had vanished from public life after entering her home. Each case bore the same pattern: estrangement, control, medical records fabricated to suggest instability, and eventually complete dependency. The media followed the story for weeks, dubbing it the Mirrorless House case. Trevor, though briefly at the center of the narrative, declined interviews and disappeared from the spotlight. He never returned to Portland. Instead, he settled in a quiet town in New Mexico, where the desert sky gave him space to breathe and think. He taught art classes at a community center, often surrounded by children who reminded him what it felt like to be unguarded. His recovery was slow, fragmented, and often lonely. Trust, once fractured, was not easily repaired. He found solace in color and form, in the way paint moved across canvas without judgment or command. His hands trembled for months, but he kept painting, piece by piece, restoring the parts of himself that had been taken. The house in Portland remained empty, its windows boarded, its silence undisturbed. For Trevor, it existed only in memory, not as a place, but as a symbol, a warning. The absence of mirrors had once seemed like a curiosity. Now it stood as a chilling reminder of how easily identity could be dismantled when love turned into control, and devotion was used as a tool to erase.